Good afternoon and welcome. And thank you for choosing DTU Business instead of spending this afternoon in the very nice weather here in Lyngby or Copenhagen. Okay, we have adjusted a little bit more. Okay, here we go. My name is Mads Christoffersen and I am responsible for DTU's Executive MBA. And we have put a small, discreet brochure on your chair. So if by any chance you are interested in knowing more about our Executive MBA, you are more than welcome to bring it with you. And we are also here for this session to inform you if you have the need of further information. However, it is not the purpose with this meeting to give you a deep orientation of the portfolio of DTU Business. You can look at the other brochure we have, and you can definitely go to our homepage for further information. Now we are here to give you a nice event and experience with one of our distinguished faculty. We have Stephan Schubert here, who is one of our faculty. Actually, he is an adjunct professor and a visiting professor here at DTU Business, as well as in INSEAD in Paris. We have asked Stephan to come and tell us a little bit more about his intimate insights into the various elements of strategy processes. Strategy is actually, he will learn us, not exactly the same thing that we learn from textbooks and from business schools professors. It is much more impacted by realities of everyday business life. So we will leave the floor to you, Stephan. So please share your deep experience with us on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I see some familiar faces, so I hope that those who've already had the pleasure or had to put up with me, depending on how you look at it, that you will not fall asleep when you find some familiar content. Well, perhaps I should start with a health warning. This will not be the typical strategy content. I've always learned and been teaching that strategy is about being different, bringing a different look to something. So what about bringing a different look or having a different look at strategy? What about trying to, well, peel away the different layers of mystique in order to understand how is strategy really made? So what I'm going to present now is not endorsed by any of these organizations who employ me. That's my personal view on strategy. So if you disagree, don't hold it against INSEAD or Ashridge or DTU Business. It's just sharing a personal opinion. I understand this is also some sort of networking event. And what do we do at networking events? We meet friends, we make new friends, we establish connections. So I thought I'd bring some of my friends to this event. Well, not real friends, intellectual friends. Good friends like Henry Mintzberg, Karl Popper, Hans Christian Andersen, and a couple of other names that we're going to meet over the next hour or so. And I also need to warn you against some false friends who might have big names, like good old Michael Porter. But this is this sort of people where you think you can rely on them. They're standing behind you. And then when you really have a problem and you need them, you turn around over your shoulder and they're not there. They don't have anything to say at that very moment. Now, for me, that's a big problem. So that's why I try to stay away from false friends and focus more on the real ones like Henry Mintzberg. The strategy industry has a dirty little secret. It doesn't have a theory on strategy creation. Now, how is that possible? Strategy is at the heart of business and business success. When we say an organization is successful, we immediately suppose, well, it must have a good strategy, otherwise it wouldn't be successful. On the other hand, if an organization is failing, it is probably because it doesn't have a strategy. So strategy is at the center of success and failure, right? So there must be then a theory behind how do we make good strategies. The naked truth is there isn't any theory. Nobody knows how to make a good strategy. There isn't any recipe, there isn't any cookbook. There are ingredients, there are tools, but then how do you actually do it? Nobody seems to know, which I find is quite disappointing. So here's my first proposition for debate. Strategy is not a science, full stop. The way it is usually presented by consultants, academics, researchers, it reminds me more of religion or even a fairy tale. Well, if it was a science, let's try to push this point a little bit further. If it was a science, then it needs to be open to an empirical approach. So that's the greatest philosopher of science, Sir Karl Popper. In empirical science, nothing can ever be proven right. You can only prove something wrong. Now, if we apply this yardstick, how much science is there in business or in strategy? How much do we really know? How many concept theories, ideas have not been proven almost immediately after their foundation or creation, have not been proven wrong? 0%. Whenever a new book comes out, a new framework comes out, a new recipe of success comes out, after a couple of months, couple of years, the companies that exemplified this approach will already be bankrupt, dead, or at least much less impressive than when the framework was created. So no science in strategy. 1982, a whole new industry started, the industry of business books, or you might even say the industry of business fads. These light-hearted ideas that seem to promise recipes for success and seem to work, but if you put them into practice, 99 out of 100% of cases, they don't. So 1982, two McKinsey consultants published this great book, In Search of Excellence. This book is based on 43 large American companies that were considered to have consistently outperformed other organizations over decades. So they were examples of greatness. The book became a huge bestseller. Between 1989 and 2006, in US public libraries, it was the most widely held book. Millions and millions and millions of sales. Even today, it is still bought. One of the authors, Tom Peters, has become a guru in his own right. And talking about his book, he admitted, well, first of all, the book was an afterthought. We had done some sort of internal research at McKinsey and then just wrote up the ideas. Then we found, well, we think we identified great companies, but we are McKinsey. We need data. We don't have any data. So after having identified the companies, they added the data. In some cases, they actually made up the data. 2 or 3 years after the publication in the mid-1980s, a dozen of the companies presented as outstanding in 1942 were no longer outstanding. But this didn't do any discredit to Tom Peters, who is still widely admired and acclaimed, and this book is still considered as the business Bible or one of the Bibles of the science of strategy. Another example, what a difference 11 months can make. January 2001, cover of Fortune, the 100 best companies to work for, top 10, number 1, Enron. For over 5 years, it has been rated America's most innovative company. All lights on green. Hail to Enron. 11 months later, Fortune, December 2001, disaster, lies, arrogance. Well, I realize I'm in the city of Hans Christian Andersen, so I thought I needed to present something along these lines. I think you're all familiar with this fairy tale and the emperor's new cloth, and actually he's standing naked. Well, if in your mind you remember this fairy tale and just translate emperor with CEO. The tailors then become consultants, making this tailor-made strategy for the organization. By emphasizing that you need to be really smart to see the strategy, you need to have at least an MBA, you need to have at least 20 years of senior executive experience, otherwise you won't understand it. So if you don't see it, you don't have strategic vision, you're not a strategist. So the result is everybody sees it, even if there isn't anything. Even if the emperor is naked, everybody will pretend, yeah, great strategy. So that's the glory of strategy. Unfortunately, in some cases, strategy is even almost presented in a mysterious way, like some form of mystique or religion you have to believe. So big companies running their corporate events, they will bring in consultants to, well, explain, like missionaries, the new strategy. It will be different forms of corporate rain dances in order to bring everybody up to speed about the new direction. And then if it fails, it is never strategy's fault. The strategy was right, but the senior management team just lacked the belief to implement it. But there was nothing wrong with the strategy or the consultants. I personally don't want to believe that. So I turn to strategy research. So if strategy wants to become a science, then there needs to be some sort of research. So perhaps research is going to the right directions and actually points us to the golden rules of success. So in preparation of this little event, I looked at hot topics that were published in the Harvard Business Review over the last 12 months. Harvard Business Review being the gold standard of research and strategy. Now, I came across this one. I really liked it. Let's go straight to the center part. There are 3 golden rules for success. Better before cheaper, so compete on differentiators other than price. Second rule, put revenue before cost. And third, there are no other rules. Now, if I translate this into plain English, the first 2 for me mean make products or services that people want to buy. That's a recipe for success. And then there is no other rule. Wow. Thousands of companies, organizations have been studied over months by Deloitte in order to come up with that rule. Isn't that a breakthrough? If you find that's great, now it gets even better. A couple of months later, again, Harvard Business Review, there's Michael D. Ryle from Rodman School of Management, a very respected school, and he's a senior faculty there. He's essentially saying the problem with strategy is we don't have a mathematical model for strategy. We need better mathematics. If we get better mathematics and build them into strategy, then we can achieve the same level of insights in strategy that we achieved in finance. Fantastic. Give this man a Nobel Prize. So proposition 2. Most strategy research that is done and translates into teaching and consulting actually suffers from a big bias, a survivorship bias. Do you know who this guy is? Who knows who this guy is?
World champion and one of the leaders?
Nope. So you don't know him. Okay. You know this guy? Who's that? Usain Bolt, fastest man in the world. Everybody knows him. Now this guy is Johan Blake. Johan Blake is the second fastest man in the world. Probably running faster than any other human being that has ever lived on this planet. And nobody knows him. That's what I mean by survivorship bias. We focus on the one winner, forgetting about number 2, number 3, forgetting about all the losers, and we assume the recipe for success, we only find it with Bolt. We cannot find it with Blake. And that's a problem with most of research and strategy. We look at winners. Focus on winners, attributing success to good strategy. Organization is successful, so strategy must be good. But what about right time, right place? Take Johan Blake. Had he lived 5 years earlier, or a couple of years later, he would be the #1. But his problem is he lives at the same time competing in the same competitions like one guy in the world that is faster than him. That's another great guy, actually 2 guys who knew a lot about survivorship bias. So this brings us a bit into politics and history. Now in the 1960s, early 1960s, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world was on the brink of nuclear war. The story was that American surveillance planes had discovered installation of nuclear missile sites on the island of Cuba. So the military tried to push President Kennedy to just bomb these sites. He didn't do it because his worry was if we start bombing their sites, then we start an escalation that will end up in nuclear war. But the point that he made precisely points to the survivorship bias, because had he done what the military pushed him to do, there would have been nobody left to actually tell the military guys that they were wrong. That's another very inspirational author that knows a lot about survivorship bias. History is written by the victors. I think if we look at every major political, historical event over the last couple of centuries, what is the version that we've got? The victors wrote that version. Now, if we ask the losers, those who are dead, what they were thinking about it, well, I guess we would get quite a different sort of interpretation. And I believe one of the reasons why, as a whole, mankind does not really seem to learn from history and stumble on from armed conflict into armed conflict is that those who suffered most from it in first place are no longer there in order to tell us how horrible it actually is. But let's get back to business. So with this survivorship bias, there's a whole list of books that you can find that I would never want to read. Books like How I Did It, Why Apple is Great, What We Can Learn from Google, How to Win, 10 Recipes for Success, 5 Steps to Wisdom, Greatness, Stardom, and whatsoever. I guess about 94,500 of the 94,637 titles that show up in an Amazon.com search under business strategy are not worth reading. If you want to know which books to read, then perhaps we should turn to this guy, another intellectual friend, Nicholas Taleb Nassim, who is this interesting combination of an investor, quite successful, philosopher, and a very arrogant man. Apart from that, he has interesting things to say. If you really want to understand success and failure, well, don't look at the podium where you see the winner. Perhaps you might want to consider going to the graveyard and looking up all the losers, all those who failed with the same strategy. So these are books that I would like to read. How Lehman Brothers Went Under, written by the people who actually made it. Olli-Pekka Kallasvuo, How I Turned Nokia into a Basket Case. Tony Hayward, How Deepwater Horizon Could Happen on My Watch. Lazaridis, How BlackBerry Lost Connection with the World. Unfortunately for us, these books are not written yet, and I'm afraid they never will. But that's where some real learning could take place. Okay, I'm getting seriously off track, so I need the slide to bring me back on. Let's turn to someone who has something interesting to say about this dirty little secret, how are strategies made? So back to history, back to politics. I like to read, and I'm disappointed by most of the books that I read. This one is different. I read it 10 years ago, and it has changed the way I look at strategy and at decision-making. That's Graham T. Allison from Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University. And in 1971, he published a book looking at the Cuban Missile Crisis. So as I just said, the world was on the brink of disaster, but apparently not. Because from a rational point of view, there was never any risk. Because the US did not decide to bomb Cuba. They went for a naval blockade, so not allowing Soviet ships to land in Cuba without being previously inspected by the US Navy. And the Soviets then made the rational choice not to retaliate, but to look for some sort of backdoor deal that would allow both sides to save their faces and still dismantle the missiles in Cuba and trade them off against some old missiles, American missiles in Turkey. So rational decision from both sides, logical process, so we were not in danger. The interesting bit comes when Allison introduces two other levels on which we can look into decision making. Organizational processes and routines, like standard operating manuals in the US Navy when they're running a blockade, like operating procedures for the CIA for surveillance flights, and organizational politics, the politics going on in the Pentagon, between Pentagon and the White House, within the Kremlin and Moscow. And the scary thing is that he discovered in his analysis that at these two levels, organizational processes and organizational politics, we were actually pushed, or the world was pushed towards nuclear war. Whereas on the rational level, the actors were trying to pull it back from the brink. But it was much closer than what a rational view, superficial view, would suggest. And that is quite fittingly summed up by Bobby Kennedy, so JFK's brother, who was Attorney General at that time. He was saying there were 14 people involved in the discussions and decision-making on the American side. If 6 of them had been president of the US instead of his brother, the world might have been blown up. The thing here is, or the interesting message is, nobody deliberately wanted nuclear war. But the way the routines and processes were working in the background, the way the political dynamics were playing out, they were pushed towards it without wanting it. And I believe if this can happen in the largest government in the world, at the very highest level, then this can happen in any sort of organization, anywhere, when strategic decisions are made. These influences or interdynamics between what you want to do deliberately, rationally, and then the processes running in the background and the politics impacting on them. Proposition 3, most research, teaching, and consulting suffers from a hindsight bias. So we are trying to rationalize ex post, when it has happened, why they did it. So this is the idea of strategic heroism, the traditional approach to strategy. Analyze your industry to death. Get all the data. Do a heroic job of analysis, and then you will see where the right position to be is. You will find the winning strategy. And the Uber guru, the high priest of that approach is Michael Porter. He says it clearly, I favor a set of analytical techniques for developing strategy. So strategy making equals analysis. Let me show you one prime example where we can see where this leads us. So that's the mid-1970s. Britain had not yet had the benefit of Margaret Thatcher, and the industry was still, well, lying flat on the floor. Mass redundancies everywhere, especially in one of their traditional export markets in the US. The market share of British motorbikes between 1959 and 1973 had come down from 50% to 10%. And that was symptomatic for British industry in general. So the government in Whitehall, they got quite worried. What did they do? Well, they were lucky. Now there was a whole new industry to help them, the strategy industry. So they turned to a newly set up outlet, the Boston Consulting Group, which was basing their analysis on insights straight out of Harvard Business School. That's Bruce Henderson, the founder of Boston Consulting Group. And they seriously pretended to make business a science, and that became their business. So they told the minister, don't worry, we're going to help you. We are sorting you out. So they delivered a 152 pages report to the British government, to the House of Commons, on why British industry is lagging behind other competitors. And they use specifically the example of the British motorcycle industry, using the traditional concepts of Boston Consulting Group like the experience curve. And on the face of it, it all made sense. The middle of their story was this fantastic motorbike. It's a Honda-produced motorbike, the Super Cub, introduced 1959 on the American market. Up to 1958, the market share of Japanese manufacturers in the US for motorbikes was 0%. In 1962, 1963, the market share of Japanese manufacturers was over 50%, with Honda having the largest share of that. So Boston Consulting Group was convinced there must be something that we can learn, that British industry can learn from Honda. So they looked deep, dug deep into the Honda success story. How could they take the market by storm with this motorbike? And that's what they found, and it made analytical sense, traditional strategy approach, low-cost strategy. They already had a dominant position in Japan, so they had economies of scale, learning effects. So driving down the experience curve, they used their cost advantage in the US. Their bikes were very reliable. Most importantly, they discovered a whole new market segment, because before, motorbikes in the US had a quite negative image associated with Hells Angels, Bandidos, and all these gangs. Honda totally repositioned the product and therefore the industry. They went after the leisure class with a nice slogan: you can meet the nicest people on the back of a Honda. So total shift of image. Brilliant idea, brilliant strategy. Also, innovative distribution. Honda didn't go through traditional dealerships. They went through retailers, department stores, because they realized there might be barriers to entry if we go through the dealerships. So very smart approach. Careful geographic expansion. They started in San Francisco. Why? Because in San Francisco, you have a large Japanese minority in the US. So they already knew the bike, so that would be a good starting point in order to penetrate the Californian market. So excellent research and development, new products. So this was presented to the British government. Boston Consulting Group sent their huge bill. Whitehall paid. Nothing happened as usual. But still, this write-up inspired case studies that were taught in MBA classes all over the world until the mid-1980s. As an example for brilliant strategy design, strategy development, and implementation. Until one guy came along who didn't want to believe. Richard Pasquale, at that time, a former McKinsey consultant, by the way. At that time, he was at Stanford Business School. Now he is at Oxford University. And he was going through these case studies that he was supposed to teach on his MBA course in Stanford on Honda. And he has been using it before for a couple of years already. And he just didn't like it. For him, something was missing there. He said to himself, I can't believe this. I can't believe how these guys from Japan, not knowing anything about the American market, were able to come up with such a brilliant strategy. How did they do it? So what he then did was taking the opposite approach to what Boston Consulting Group did. If you're at Boston Consulting Group or McKinsey and you get that sort of contract or mission from Whitehall or any other client, and you have a short time frame, results have to be in 1 week later, what you do is, well, bring in all the junior analysts, those who only can deal with data, and that's all they understand. Let them look over the data, compile it, print it out in spreadsheets and graphs, and just write something around it to make it sound nice. That is exactly what Boston Consulting Group had done. What Pasquale did was taking the time. He went to the dean of Stanford Business School, asking him for a return ticket to Tokyo and a week off in order to find and interview the Japanese managers who actually run the operations. He was lucky they were still alive. He found them in a retirement home owned by Honda, and he met them over tea one afternoon. And they were surprised to learn that their bike, that Honda, had become world famous. What they told him was that, in truth, we had no strategy other than the idea of seeing if we could sell something in the US. This is where it all started, with this little shed in San Francisco. They didn't know anything about the American market. They didn't know, for example, that the motorbike industry in the US is a seasonal industry. So you will have strong sales when it comes out of winter, getting into spring and early summer. Then over summer, everybody will ride the bike. And then autumn, it will decline. Nobody will buy a bike for winter. They arrived in autumn because they didn't know that. They never intended to sell the Super Gap, the small bike. What they wanted to sell were the big 500 cc's, because they wanted to compete with the Triumphs and Harley-Davidson. They wanted to be seen as a real motorbike manufacturer, like all the others. What they didn't know either was that motorbikes were driven in a very different way in the US compared to Japan. In Japan, they're driven in inner cities, short distances. In California, well, long distances, open highway. So the few bikes that they managed to sell, the big 500s, after a couple of days already, they were returned because they were breaking down. The engine was not geared, was not made for the American environment. They found it very difficult to actually get into dealerships. They never intended to approach department stores. Their idea was, well, if we want to compete with the big guys, then we have to sell them in the same places. So they approached all the different dealerships, and they were turned down by everybody. So they were starting to despair. The bikes, the 500s, had been sent back to Japan for repair. Nobody seemed to want them anyway. The dealerships were saying them, no, we don't want your bikes. They had arrived at the wrong time of the season. Their cash was running out. In their minds, they'd already decided, okay, that's a disaster. Let's forget about that. We still have a bit of money to spend. While we're here, why don't we do a bit of tourism and driving around California with our own bikes, the small ones, the 50 cc's, which they had brought for their own pleasure and leisure from Japan. So that's what they're doing. And after 1 week of doing tourism, on the streets of San Francisco, quite literally, they were stopped by a guy who introduced himself as the purchasing manager of C.S. Roebuck, the big department store. The guy said, well, what are you driving there? I've never seen this before. They politely explained to him that this was very popular in Japan, but they were not in the US in order to sell these bikes. But he insisted he really wanted to have them. He really wanted to have a dozen bikes to integrate them in the portfolio of his store, because he thought American customers might actually like that. You think what was the reply of the Japanese? Say, sorry, we can't do. We can't do because we are not here to sell the small ones. This would destroy our image. We want to compete with Harley-Davidson, with Triumph. We cannot be seen as a producer of small bikes in the US. But they stayed in contact, and the purchasing manager was resilient, and after a couple of days, finally they decided, okay, let's have him his dozen bikes, and at least he will go away. So he took the bikes, and after a couple of days, they were sold out, coming back for more. At the same time, another coincidence happened, and that was at the University of California. One of the first customers of the small bikes was actually a student, a college student. And he was driving around their campus, parking it under the window of his dormitory. Looking through the window was another student who was just working on his marketing assignment for his degree program. And he couldn't find a topic to write about. So when he saw this bike, went down to talk to the other guy, what's that? That's so nice, that's so different. he decided on the spot, I will write my marketing assignment on that bike. And at the heart of the assignment was a slogan that he developed for that bike, which is, you can meet the nicest people on the back of a Honda. So he turned in his assignment. Professor is very happy, top grades. Asked him, can I use your assignment? So, sure, of course. Professor sends it to a friend who works in a marketing agency. They think that's a fantastic idea. So they call, again, the Japanese executives in California. Guys, we have a fantastic slogan for you. We will rebrand your product. You will tap into a whole new category of buyers. I think you already know what their reply was. Sorry, can't do. We don't want this family-friendly image. Why don't you guys get it? We want to compete with Harley-Davidson and Triumph. So then after weeks of discussion with Honda headquarters in Japan, headquarters finally gave the green light. Okay, let these guys do with our product whatever they want to do. We've closed down the operations anyway. So CS Roebuck got the small bikes. They were allowed to run with this marketing campaign. And after a couple of weeks, the market just shot up and it became a runaway success. So that is the real Honda story, which doesn't have anything to do, anything at all, with deliberate strategy, deliberate planning. They hadn't any idea or any correct idea about the American market. But in the end, they got there. So at the end of the conversation that Pasquale had with these guys, he said, but there must be one thing that you really did well. You started in San Francisco. There were Japanese, they must have helped you. That was a smart choice. At that moment, the Japanese started to smile at him, say, sir, when you put a cargo on a boat in Tokyo Harbor and let it float, where does it end up? Well, in San Francisco, right. So the real Honda story has a lot to do about trial and error. Initial misconceptions, but then adaptation, resilience, serendipity. Now, serendipity is different from luck. Luck is, well, you play lotto, then you win, that's luck. Serendipity is trying and trying and trying again. Try harder, then you will get lucky. The harder I work, the luckier I get. Mark Twain was spot on. That's just another version of the Honda story. IKEA is often presented as, well, the poster child of blue ocean strategy, blue ocean innovation, totally different approach to running the furniture business, innovative value positioning. Yes, it's true. If you look at it with hindsight, it is true. But how did they get there? Now, I will spare you all the details, but if you look into the insides of the IKEA story, it is exactly the same. There had never been this intention of turning the furniture industry on its head. Well, right from the start, actually, Campra didn't want to do furniture at all. It was a mail order business focusing on Christmas cards and fountain pens. It is only when a competitor started to add furniture to his catalog that Campra decided, okay, we're going to do the same. But then, where do I find suppliers? Swedish suppliers didn't want to supply him because they were under pressure from their own customers. So he had to go to Poland. But in Poland, the skill set wasn't the same among the labor force than in Sweden. So they couldn't do any complicated things. And then shipping costs were high. And then if you supply assembled, finished products from Poland, then you have to pay higher insurance premium. And Kamprad, being someone who's very close to his money, he wanted to bring insurance premiums as low as possible. So then the only solution was, okay, we just import unassembled furniture from Poland. So that's the starting point of the flat pack boxes. So again, no strategic design, adapting to a constraint. And then on it went the decision to open the first showroom. The idea was not to actually sell something there. It was to bring customers to the store so that they could look at the products, drive home again, and then order from the catalog. In order to give them an incentive to drive the long distances to Elmhult, the central warehouse, they then decided to offer buns and coffee. So that's the start of the IKEA canteen and kitchen services. Then, 1965, introduction of VAT in Sweden, rush of customers putting in their mail orders, and the mail order department at IKEA decided, we can't supply them all. We are totally overflooded with orders. So what they decided to do is, well, we call our customers, we mail them, we tell them, if you want to make sure to get your piece of furniture before the introduction of the VAT, then quickly come to our warehouse and pick it up. That's where the concept then finally of the IKEA stores as we know them today started. So similar case as Honda, no design at all. It's just trying something, running into barriers, then thinking how can we get around these barriers, adapting to constraints until you finally come up with the right solution. This is how successful strategies are made. So strategy in that sense is a dynamic process. You start by wanting to do something. Try to implement that, and you will realize immediately half of what you plan to do will not work. The people cannot deal with it, we don't have the capabilities, the customer doesn't want it, and so on. But at the same time, while you are out there in the market, you see things that you didn't see before. You spot opportunities, and you had to be out there in order to see them. You get interesting feedback from customers, and this part then you integrate in your strategy. That's the emergent bit of strategy. So what you realize at the end, the outcome, will be very different from what you plan to do. Then the good organizations, they are then able to contrast these two, to interpret the gap. How did we end up there when we wanted to do this? Is it better? Shall we continue on that road? So having this learning feedback, and then you go on and on again. So strategy as a process. Proposition 4. So strategy is a process, and this process is automated in many organizations. So that's a proposition about strategy making by autopilot. That's a mystery of the chimney. That happened in the US a couple of years ago. The controller in a large organization, industrial conglomerate, came across a capital budget spending proposal from the manufacturing division, and on the proposal was just one position, a chimney, 500,000. He was looking at it, the chimney, what do you want to do with the chimney? So he decided that's too mysterious, hopped on a plane, went to see the manufacturing plant. What he saw was a new plant under construction, of which he didn't have any idea at all. What the manufacturing division had done was taking the plant, cutting it into small pieces, small work orders that could escape corporate radar, didn't require corporate approval. The only thing they couldn't cut into meaningful pieces was a chimney. So after some more investigation, he found out that this manufacturing division saw an opportunity in the market. But they felt we need to move fast if we want to expand capacity. But if we put this through the normal corporate approval process, by the time we get the green light, the opportunity is gone. So with hindsight, they made the right decision. Intel's exit from memory chips. Memory chips were at the heart of their business. That's where they grew up with. But in the 1970s, they introduced a second product line, microprocessors. At the start, it didn't work very well, so memory chips were the bread and butter business. But then the early 1980s, Japanese competition in the memory business sector became stronger and stronger. Their margins got under pressure, whereas microprocessor sales were increasing with better margins. So 1985, 1986, crisis at the top of Intel. Shall we get out of memory chips or not? Shall we do it or not? Do it or not? For about a year, they were discussing internally what would it mean to the company, the heritage, the culture, and so on. When they finally made the decision, they realized, oh, actually, we don't do any memory chips anymore. Because the organization by itself had already anticipated that decision. How? Well, through routine processes. So every month, you had these resource allocation meetings where they would decide for the next 30 days, where will our wafer capacity go? Which percentage will go to memory chips and which percentage will go to semiconductors? And these decisions were driven only by financial rules. So they had just to look at the margins. They saw the margin development going down for memory chips, going up for microprocessors, and they just reallocated capacity, so actually drove Intel out of the market before they made the decision. You think that's an exception? There's more. Michael Dell, Dell Computers. Again, very good strategy, started to expand globally with direct sales business, and here, really for once, it was a deliberate decision not to get into the consumer market. Why? If you want to market to consumers, you will have lower margins, it will take longer, you have to run after individual people, so it's costly, it's expensive. They decided we only do corporate accounts. Even 1993, Bain Consultants again dissuaded Dell from getting to the consumer business. Now, what happened throughout the 1990s was that people who had a Dell at work in their company started to actually like these devices. Because with this idea of customization, you can have what you want. They started to call Dell. We know that you don't really sell to individuals, but I'm really interested in this one and that one. What would the price be? Well, there wasn't any rule inside Dell to prevent people from selling to individuals. So actually, a customer business developed under the radar screen within Dell, and it was growing. And to their surprise, Dell by 95 noticed that even their margins were quite healthy in that business, higher than margins of competitors in that area. So in 1997, they made the official decision, Dell is now entering the consumer business. By that time, at that moment, the consumer business was already several $billion strong. So again, strategy decided officially, but the real work has been running in the background, organizational processes operating the strategic shift. That's what I mean, strategy by autopilot. Right, I have to accelerate a little bit, I guess. Proposition 5, culture eats strategy for breakfast. That's the story of a Silicon Valley company. Spin-off from Cirrus Logic, 1996, 30 engineers, highly qualified engineers, set up a new company called Lexar. They called it Lexar Media, based on new patents in the flash memory field, which was quite a technological breakthrough at that time. They realized we are engineers, we don't know how to run businesses. So they hired an outside CEO. This CEO was obsessed with photography. He immediately saw how flash memories could work as a sort of digital film. So right from the outset, the whole company was focused on photography. We want to become a digital photography company. All the discussions inside the organization were around photography. Individual employees were given cameras, digital cameras for the holidays, so they would always think photography. Interestingly, internally, Lexar employees for data transfer also used that technology and put it on some sort of USB stick. They thought this works quite well. They never, ever had the idea of bringing to the market a flash memory USB stick. It was their competitor SanDisk who was the first one coming out with it. Only 18 months later, 18 months is an eternity for Silicon Valley, did Lexar come out with its own version of USB flash memory stick. By then, it was too late. They just could not see it. It was not on their radar screen. They were so blinded by the way they saw themselves as a digital photography company. Similar example, similar sad story, Kodak. Throughout the 1980s, 1990s, Kodak was obsessed by fighting against Fuji. Fuji were the bad guys, Fuji is the enemy. So if you were a Kodak executive, you would get out of the bed in the morning. How can I kill Fuji today? And they were very good at that. Unfortunately, while they were doing that, they missed a couple of other things. Things like the digital world. which then ultimately led to the downfall. So from almost 100,000 employees, they are down to little more than 2,000, less than 10,000 employees, who today are actually not selling products, they are selling off patents just to keep the company afloat for a couple of months more. So it's a dead man walking, it's a zombie company. It's a very sad story, because you know who invented digital photography? Kodak. 1975, the world's first digital camera was invented by Kodak. The problem was that Kodak's heritage, roots, culture was in chemistry. Chemistry was everything. If you wanted to get to the top within Kodak, there were only two valuable paths into senior management. One was you had to be a chemist or chemical engineer. The other one was you had to be a manufacturing engineer. If you had one of these two qualifications, then you were fine. If you were an outsider coming from another technology field, you would never make it up there. So they ended up having a senior leadership team that was very much alike in many ways, the vast majority trained as chemists or manufacturing engineers. So 1993, new CEO came in because the board became a bit worried we're missing out on something. They brought in a high-tech CEO, George Fisher, ex-Motorola guy. And he saw the danger lurking around the corner. We're not ready for the digital world. After a couple of years, he finally managed to convert the top team to the new vision. But he didn't have the time anymore to drive change through the middle layers of the large army of corporate management. And that's why Kodak is dead now. Proposition 6. So culture is important, but politics is also important. Because at the end of the day, strategy making is a game of politics. And I believe we all know hidden agendas. And I think we also, all of us, might have our own personal agenda. So why not be honest about it? Because if it exists, it must have an impact on strategy making. These are the two most important men in world football. Sepp Blatter, FIFA president, right-hand side. Michel Platini, UEFA president, left-hand side. For many years, they were best friends. But then, somehow, one day, Blatter decided, I don't like this guy anymore. I don't think he's up to the task. I don't want him to be my successor. And from that moment on, world football is split. On every possible issue that is debated in world football, you will find that these two people take the extreme opposite view. If one will say A, the other one will say B. This doesn't have any rational foundation. It is just politics because they can't stand each other. Like these two guys. Also best friends for a long time. Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, they had made some sort of deal in the mid-1990s that Brown would help Blair to get elected to become prime minister, and then, after one or two legislatures, Blair would resign and hand over to Brown. Well, Blair decided Brown is not up to the task, so I go on for a bit more. And Brown is quoted by saying, there's nothing you could ever say to me now that I could ever believe. So for 2 years, 3 years almost, 2004, 2007, British politics were paralyzed. Not by a debate between Labour in power and the Conservatives, no, by internal politics. Because at Downing Street number 10, the Prime Minister's residency, they were obsessed by shooting down initiatives from the neighbours, Downing Street number 11, the Chancellor, and vice versa. And if you want to understand British politics in these 3 years, if you only look at rational arguments, you will miss it. If you only look at party politics, you will also miss it. It is only when you take into consideration the conflict between two guys who hate each other, then you can really understand some of the decisions that were made. So that, unfortunately, is a reality. It happens every day. Personal agendas, hidden agendas driving decision-making. Now, where do we go from here? That's where what like to introduce my personal framework how to deal with strategy making, so bringing some of these different strands, hopefully, together. And I use the analogy of the DNA, because I think strategies and organizations have a DNA. So how are strategies really made based on what we said? There's a decision-making process. So strategies, yes, are the results of decision-making. And this process can be deliberate. We have a strategy meeting, we make a decision. Or it can also be a routine resource allocation process. Then you have decision relays where you can pass over from one path to the other. So for example, when Dell recognized the entry into the consumer market as a strategy, it is a decision made at routine resource allocation level that is passed on to deliberate decision making. And when they decided at Kodak, we need to get into digital imaging, it goes the other way around. It's deliberate strategic decision making, which is handed down to routine resource allocation. This happens in the context of culture. By culture, I mean perceived identity, like Kodak being focused on Fuji, like Lexa seeing itself as a digital film company, mental framework, sense of mission, silos, alignment, values, norms, balances between preservation and renewal. And finally, we have politics as an influence factor. So what we see at the end, strategy will be a combination of deliberate decision making, where we are aware that we made this decision, and well, emerging elements where we are quite unaware of them. So this leads to the DNA of strategy. D, standing for decision-making processes, N, norms and organizational cultures, and A, for personal agendas and organizational politics. Now, my idea in using this DNA framework is that I believe if organizations do not renew their DNA, they will always produce more of the same. So how can you expect an organization to work towards strategic change if you have the same culture in place, if the same people are still there with the same interpersonal conflicts and hidden agendas? You might declare it at the top, we have a strategic shift. At the bottom, it will never go there. So if you want strategic change and renewal, you have to change the DNA. So one way of doing that is, or one example for this is given by a very interesting company, the Cemex, one of the top 3 global leaders in building materials, cement. They're interesting because they're born in a third world country in Mexico, but getting to global leadership through acquisition, fast implementation, with a very interesting approach. Whenever they acquire a company, what they do is they replace immediately 80% of that company's processes by global Cemex processes, so that the new company can function quickly according to the same benchmarks. But then, these 80% of processes that get kicked out, they are not thrown into the basket. They will archive, they will be preserved. After a couple of weeks, experts from different locations within Cemex will study these processes to see, well, actually, was this inferior to what we're doing in other locations, or is it equally good and even better? And if it is deemed to be better, not only it is immediately then handed back, this way of doing, to the acquired organization, it is actually rolled out across all Cemex sites with the managers who invented that process being then the ambassadors for other Cemex locations. So this is a constant updating of the D part of their strategy DNA. Today, about 70% of Cemex global processes actually originated in the acquired companies all over the world. And finally, what they also do is that making data public as much as possible internally at Cemex. So all manufacturing, inventory, sales, administrative data will be in real time accessible to managers from all sites which means if we have transparency of information, we limit the potential for political gaming, because information is power. If I can hold information from others, shield it from others, hide behind information, then I have power and I can play my games. So if you make the information transparent, shared with everybody, you take that power away. So you're working on the A of the DNA, and also you're saying something about the culture that you want to have in this organization, a culture of sharing and openness, which is an updating of the N of the organization. So in that way, I think that's one of the examples how organizations can update their DNA in order to work towards strategic change. Finally, coming to the end of my presentation, I started with a bit of pieces of health advice, and I would like to finish with one. So next time, when you're going to a bookshop or the airport bookstore, and you might want something to read for a 2-hour flight or just for the weekend, something inspirational about business, brand new concepts, and you come across these fantastic titles, How to Win and all the others that I named, just remind yourself of a short story that I'm going to share with you. Once upon a time, there was a young knight. So we're in the dark, deep Middle Ages. And this knight was coming back from war. War was over. Peace was reigning all over Europe. And he was a bit worried about his career and even employment perspectives. What use is a knight when there is no war? So he felt he had to retrain, acquire new skills. So he was marching around. You see, he's on foot. He already had to sell his horse. Just a couple of gold coins left in his pocket. And he sees the sign, Academy of Dragon Slaying. I thought to himself, oh, that sounds interesting, really interesting. That is a new skill. Not many people will have that skill. So if I retrain as a dragon slayer, I might be pretty much in demand. My future will be secured. So he agrees to part with his couple of gold coins, gives it to the knight who looks after the castle, and enrolls in the Academy of Dragon Slaying. And he never regretted it, because the training, the teaching was fantastic. They were working with case studies of St. George killing a dragon, international cases in Germany, Siegfried killing a dragon, advanced modules on weaponry, very thorough inspection of the anatomy of a dragon. But the best bit came at the very end of the program. In order to graduate, he had to demonstrate his skills. So he had to kill a real dragon. Well, unfortunately, even at that time, there was already health and safety. That was what he was told. So they couldn't bring a real dragon into the castle. What they did was import a paper dragon from China. And in his final assessment, he had to tear out his sword and chop off the head of the paper dragon. So as a demonstration, he knows how to kill dragons. He did this brilliantly, passed with first-class honors, and was awarded the certificate of a dragon slayer accredited by the Dragon Slayers Guild. So graduation day is very proud and impatient to start his new job as a dragon killer. So he asked the senior knight, so where can I now find dragons to kill? You know what the answer was? Nowhere, of course. There aren't any dragons. Don't you know that? There are no dragons around. They don't exist. They never existed. So that moment, his heart sinks. I've given my last coins of gold investing in acquiring a new skill that will be totally useless. You screwed me. I'm lost. What am I supposed to do now? Then, reassuring answer of the knight, just open your own dragon slaying academy. Thank you very much.
Thank you a lot, Stephan. I think we do have time for a couple of questions, so we will have the microphone wandering around. Who would be the first to ask a question? Yeah, we have questions over here.
Thanks. I want to ask, why do you call Michael Porter a false friend? I know you may not have a lot of time to explain, but in short, if you can explain.
A real friend for me is somebody you can rely on. So somebody on whose advice you can rely on, who has something to say when you need him. Try to develop strategy and to define the right strategy with Porter's frameworks. You can't. You can analyze the industry, you can understand what is going on, and then where do you go from there? Does he have anything to say about this? No. He doesn't tell you how to make strategy. That's why he's a false friend.
Another question?
So your best advice will be not to join the MBA, but enjoy the International Brotherhood of Magicians and be a good storyteller and found your consulting company.
My best advice would be to be very careful about this sort of MBA program that you want to enroll in. For example, somebody like Henry Mintzberg generally doesn't like MBAs. He's written a whole book on it. We need managers, not MBAs. If you look very careful in the book, he also identifies MBA programs that are different from the traditional North American undergraduate MBA model, the pre-experience MBA that you can find at North American institutions. For Mintzberg, an MBA can make a lot of sense if you work with experienced people, in a group of experienced people, with real-life issues, not with case studies that come in the Harvard 35 pages format and you have to go through 3 or 4 per day, but in a real case, a real consultancy project in a company that pays for it or that actually needs you as a helper, as a helping hand. So that sort of MBA program, and which I understand is the case here at DTU, actually adds a lot of value. So my advice, be very careful about the sort of MBA program you enroll in.
I should add that we have no lessons in dragon killing or slaying in our course.
Thank you, Stephan. Very interesting perspective. One question, since I think that we are now all convinced that this is the way that that strategy is developed in corporations. How would you characterize the ideal CEO or managing director in such a scenario?
Well, probably you can write a book about the answer. I think the ideal CEO would be miles away from the traditional image of the CEO as a strategist who goes to the whiteboard, perhaps with 2, 3 advisors, a couple of consultants, and then draws up the strategy. The CEO would be, in large organizations at least, someone who gives a sense of direction. These are the broad areas where we think, or where I think we should go. And then, I know this word has been used so often that it almost doesn't have any meaning anymore, but really empowers people to actually try something, exploring different areas, also challenging the established consensus, challenging even the CEO. So you, as a CEO, probably you have to admit that you don't have all the answers. The only thing, I think a lot of good strategy teaching and consulting goes that way, the focus turns away from giving answers to asking questions. So focusing on the right questions to ask and enabling organizational processes, involving processes where people can participate in finding the answers, that should be the role of a CEO.
Another question? So I think that we should thank you, Stephen, very much, Stephan, for your very nice and thought-provoking, inspiring presentation. And I think that we should urge you to write the books that have not yet been written.
The Dragon Slayer.
And I promise that once it is written, it will be part of the curriculum. and in each and every, especially the strategy syllabus. We will definitely integrate that. So thank you for coming here. I should say another that we have a little brochure on our executive MBA, which, by the way, just recently got an international accreditation, and also our brand new program, Managing for Growth, that we would like you to be familiar with and bring the good word out to our friends in this community. So thank you for coming, and thank you for Stephan, and I think you all should merit a drink or a refreshment before we close this session. So thank you very much.